We've alluded to the topic of this video in previous practice sessions, but what happens when you put one block of code inside of another block of code? How does the code behave? What does the code look like? We're going to answer all of those questions in this video. So to start, as we start every video, we are going to create a new file, and that file is going to be called nested blocks. So we're going to put one block of code inside of another block of code. That's nested blocks. And I am going to save this. So in my index.html. So I saved the reference, and then I also need the file, right? So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to right click. I'm going to create a new file. And then I'm going to create a file called nested blocks with the hyphen .js. And then enter. So this one's going to be a little bit of a shorter one, but we're just going to talk about what it looks like to put one block of code inside of another block of code, what a block of code is, what those brackets are doing, just getting a little bit of experience with that. So I'm just going to say I'm going to declare a variable myNumber, and let's just say that number is equal to 14, and I'm going to create an if statement. And let's say I want to check if this number is between two values. So I'm just going to say if my number is less than 100. And then I'm also going to check, so inside these brackets here, I'm also going to check if that number is greater than 0. So one way to do that is to put an if statement inside of another if statement. So this if statement exists between these brackets, right? So before this bracket closes, we're putting this if statement in here. And so what that means is that this if statement is only going to execute when my number is less than 100. All right? So if my number is less than 100 and my number is also greater than 0, we're just going to console log your number is between 0 and 100. All right. Let's go ahead and test this, but before I do, I actually do want to console log what my number is. So I'm just going to add a string. And then I'm going to say plus, and then I'm going to put my number. All right, so stuff we've done. Save this. When I go to my console, click refresh. Go to my actual console. So it says your number is 14, your number is between 0 and 100. So that's the basics of what nested blocks is. You have one block of code that is inside or nested, like I guess like a bird nest. You got the little bird in a nest inside of another block of code. And so this inner block begins and ends here. So that's for this if statement. And then your outer block begins and ends here for this outer if statement. Let's play with this a bit. Let's take this if statement and let's see how our code behaves differently when this if statement is outside of our previous if statement that it was nested in. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to console log, and I'm going to say your number is greater than 100. All right, so I've got this if statement and I've got this if statement, and they're different. They're completely different if statements. They're no longer nested. So let's see how the behavior changes. So we are now tracking if our number is less than 100. I should say less than 100. And I'm going to, let's go ahead and just run this, just make sure it works. Numbers less than 100, numbers between 0 and 100. And now what we're going to do is we are going to make this number greater than 100. Oops. So some value greater than 100. So let's make it 400. I'm going to run this, and I'd like you to notice something. So we're lying to our users, right? So your number is between 0 and 100 when it's actually not. The only way to make that a true statement is we only want this if statement to execute when our number is less than 100, right? So I'm going to press Control X. I'm going to press enter in here. I'm going to, before this bracket ends, I'm going to put that if statement back inside. I'd like you to notice something else. Adam kind of does it for us to make our code a little more organized, visibly for us as developers to see. But notice that our code is a little to the right when it's inside brackets. That is, you don't have to do that, but it's a convention that developers follow. It's called indenting. So when you're inside of any brackets, you write your code a little bit to the right. That could be by a tab, that could be by a space, but just make sure that you're just aware of that convention, because when you read other people's code, or when you want to write code that's easy to read yourself, you might want to do that, right? You might want to make sure that you leave a little bit of space. And if I were theoretically, if I were to make another, let's say I can make another if statement, I mean, I could just keep going, right? I mean, we could just say my number is equal to 6 or something like that. You would indent that as well. So you can keep going on, but you're just, every single time you're inside another block of code, you're moving a little to the right. It could be by a tab, could be by a space. So just so you're aware of the way that that looks, right? And so we could just keep going with this. So I'd like to do one more example, and that is going to be an if statement nested in a while loop. So the while keyword, when we make a while loop, also involves, when we set it up, it involves a block of code. And in that block of code, we can put other blocks of code, just like anything else. So let's go ahead and do that. I would like to execute this while loop a number of times. And in order to track how many times I want to execute it, I need to create a counter. So I'll just create my counter, and then I'll say while counter is less than 8, so we'll just execute the while loop 8 times. I want to do something. Now, one thing I want to do no matter what is, let's say I just want to output my counter to the console. So I could just say console.log, and then I could output counter is now, and then whatever the counter is. All right. And then I can put my if statement. So I'm operating within this block of code, right? So I can just go ahead and put my if statement here. And the if statement will only execute when the while loop executes and the if conditional is true. So let's go ahead and check. Let's see. Let's check if our counter is greater than my number. Right? So we declared my number at the top. We still have access to it. So if counter is ever greater than my number, whatever's inside these brackets is going to execute, right? So I'm just going to say console.log, and then I'm going to say counter is greater than, and then whatever my number is. So actually what I'm going to do, instead of counter, I'm going to just say counter. So whatever counter is. So we'll say counter is greater than my number. And let's go ahead and run this. Let's make my number a value between 0 and 8 so we can actually test if this works. So I'll just make that 5. And then I'll save this. So I am missing one thing, aren't I? I need to also iterate my counter, right? So I need to make sure that my counter I've got to make sure my exit strategy is in place so I don't create that infinite while loop, right? So I'm going to say counter is equal to counter plus 1. Notice I'm not operating in the if statement. I am doing this no matter what so that we can make sure that we can end this while loop. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to save that. So I open my browser, click refresh, go to my console. So I'm in my console now, and here's my output. And you'll notice that we have counters always executing. So it says counter 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then once we have 6 is greater than 5. So in the same while loop block, we are executing both of these console logs. So now our if statement within our while loop is executing. So that's the sort of basics of preparing blocks of code and writing using nested blocks of code. Practice incoming. So short video, short practice, 2 problems, and then this first problem here has 2 separate parts to it. You solve these 2 basically the same way. For what value of x does the following code output to the console? So answer that question for each of these blocks of code. So what value of x allows this line of code to execute and say you win the prize? What values of x make that work? All right. And then also for this block of code, what values of x allow it so that we output a value? Or sorry, that we console log this statement. All right. So that's number 1. Number 2, make a nested if statement that checks if a number is between -17 and 17. So like I said, short video, short practice, no bonus at all. Just go ahead and do this. Make sure that we're good with this, and then we'll go to the next topic.